Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. What are you doing? Anyway, I want to introduce you to Rameez Kaleem, who is actually a repeat guest. Rameez was on the podcast almost exactly 2 years ago to the day to talk about pay transparency. So let me reintroduce you to him and we will kick off the discussion. So Rameez is the founder and managing director at 3R Strategy, an independent reward consultancy dedicated to helping organizations build a culture of trust through pay transparency. Rameez graduated in economics from University College London and began his career in consultancy, initially working in global mobility and then as a reward consultant at Willis Towers Watson. He worked in several in-house reward roles before quitting the corporate world to set up 3R Strategy to support organizations on their journey toward pay transparency. And of course, with over 20 years in pay and rewards, he consults extensively on these topics and naturally speaks regularly in HR forums and podcasts just like this one. Rameez, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Traci. No, thanks for inviting me back onto your podcast.
Of course. Anytime. Maybe you'll come back for a third time too, because pay transparency is a very important topic. And I imagine that we covered it 2 years ago also, but maybe to kick things off, we first start by explaining what pay transparency is in the event that someone may not have a clear understanding.
Yeah, sure. So you're right. Pay transparency is a term that gets used a lot now. It's, when I was talking about this 10 years ago, it was alien to a lot of organizations, but I think it can often be confused as well, and it can be seen as a binary issue. So you either have it or you don't. But the fact is, pay transparency is more of a scale, and you can be at different points within that scale. So it's some people can think pay transparency means everyone is going to know what everyone else gets paid, but that's really not what transparency is about. It's more around giving people context around how we make pay decisions and what is our purpose, what are our principles. So we demonstrate fairness through our processes. And so that could mean for one organization that you have a set of principles that you share with your employees. For another organization, it might mean that you have salary ranges across your organization. For another, it might mean encouraging managers to have open pay conversations with their employees. So it can mean different things, but ultimately it's about demonstrating fairness and a commitment to pay equity.
Absolutely. Thank you for explaining that. I really love that you pointed out that pay transparency does not necessarily mean that everyone knows what you're earning, because that's kind of up to the person. If you share, that's on you. But organizations are not really inclined to share that much detail. Certainly, I've seen organizations share the ranges for certain jobs, which is sometimes a requirement depending on the state that someone lives in within the United States, at least. But I digress. I really want to dive into this global salary planning report that and I imagine it's you and your team that pulled this together. Is that accurate?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. We publish
Amazing.
this on an annual basis.
Amazing. Well, it has a lot of really, really effective and clear detail, I would say. And what's interesting, and this for the listeners, this is for the 2024-2025 year. And what's really helpful about these insights is that you cover a lot of I'll say like data points that people often ask about. For example, inflation and cost of living. Even like I was talking to a few friends who were like, oh, my increase this year didn't even cover inflation. Inflation in the US is like 6 to 7%, and they received like a 3%, 2 to 3% increase respectively. And of course, that's speaking from a US context, but I'm curious, when you think about some of these salary trends and data insights that you pull in to this report, what are some of the trends that you see, especially related to inflation and cost of living around the world?
Yeah, the inflation and cost of living is the reason we initially started publishing this survey, and then gradually evolved into a much bigger survey. And so this year we did cover around 40 countries across around 20 different industry sectors. So we covered the US and the UK. And for 2024, the salary increase budget for both countries was shown to be 4%. And, um, like you said, over the last few years, inflation has been a bit high. And for example, in 2022, I think in the UK, it was close to 9-10%. It was
Mm,
similar in the US. And so it's been quite challenging for HR teams to share the pay budgets with their employees, because employees are saying, well, inflation's 10%. My purchasing power is going down because salaries are only going up by 4%.
right.
Um, and it's been challenging for HR, but we do understand what it is from the organization's perspective, because they don't necessarily increase their revenue or their prices for their customers by 10%, so they're
Right.
not able to necessarily pay employees. But this year, what we've seen, so in the UK, the projected pay increase for 2025 is 3.5%. In the US, is 3.4%. But we've seen inflation is below that for the first time since the pandemic. So it's actually a positive message for a lot of HR professionals to share with their employees that for the first time since the pandemic, they will see a slight increase in their real wage.
Mm,
And I think part of that message, what HR teams and professionals can do, is to talk about how the way that we set budgets is not linked directly to inflation. Obviously, we try and give increases as much as we can aligned to inflation, but there will be years like this year where budgets can be higher because it's down to affordability, it's down to how the business is doing, it's down to our strategic objectives, how the market is moving. But in other years, like we've had since the pandemic, inflation will be high, but it just won't be practical for organizations to match that.
right. That's really helpful. This does make me think about how we can help level set expectations, we meaning HR professionals and other business leaders, frankly, that it's not expected for organizations to compete with inflation. First of all, you could also make the argument that if inflation is at the lowest it's ever been, you're not going to lower pay increase budgets
Mm,
necessarily, right? So
exactly.
it's usually when inflation is higher that everyone's like, "Oh, well my increase needs to be higher because of cost of living changes." But again, things ebb and flow so rapidly and so often that businesses can't reasonably operate in such short-term methodologies as it relates to their thinking and their strategies. I mean, there has to be a longer term application there. And also, to your point, the better businesses do, the more flexibility they have with how they pay. I know I think recently, I don't want to misspeak. I can't remember which company took some heat for this. It was a tech company, I think, though, that recently raised executive bonuses and increased the amount that executives would be able to bonus on and receive.
Mm.
And this particular company took a lot of heat from, of course, their average employee, let's say, who maybe is feeling like their increase is not substantial enough or that they are not earning enough of a wage. What are your thoughts, related, of course, to pay transparency, to companies sharing what their executives can bonus or how much their earning potential is? Like, do you think that there's an element there where pay transparency does potentially more harm than good, or is it just all good to have that level of transparency?
I think it's there's different levels of transparency, like we said. So not
Right.
all organizations will be sharing what pay increases they're giving to everyone, what bonuses they're giving to everyone. So I think if there is transparency across the organization around these issues, then it should be the same for the executives. Um, I
Hmm.
there is definitely a challenge here, because it can be difficult to communicate some of those messages, because there's a big difference between what executives get paid and often what
Yeah.
employees get paid. And I think employees, for example, the way some of these decisions are made is through um, salary benchmarking, for example. So what is the market paying for these jobs, and you try and align to the market. And unless you share a lot of this context with employees, then and you're all you're sharing is the outcomes and the numbers, I think inevitably there is going to be some backlash when you have that sort of transparency without any context. So that's why I talked about the scale earlier on pay
Yeah.
transparency. And I think what we shouldn't do is think about sharing outcomes, sharing what somebody is getting paid, what somebody is getting given as a bonus, without going through the whole journey of sharing these are our principles. This is where these are the organizations we benchmark against. This is how we evaluate jobs. This is how we set our pay ranges. And then once when you share the outcome, you're more likely to get the buy-in from employees, because they if it is actually fair, they will see the fairness behind those outcomes. But if you have inconsistent decision making between execs and the rest of the employees, then regardless of the context, you will have trouble, uh, you know,
Yeah.
with that transparency.
Yeah, rough waters ahead. No, it makes a lot of sense. And the concept of pay principles and processes, this is also a part of your report. And something that you wrote is that uh, it's encouraging to see that nearly 2/3 of organizations have established clear pay principles, and processes, which provides a solid foundation for pay transparency and fairness. To your point that you've just made, what are some of those pay principles and processes that you see typically related to pay transparency?
So I think um, the first thing is having the set of reward principles. So in the same way that we have organizational values, we need to have some principles around how we manage pay, which is sort of our why. If Simon Sinek, he talks about start with why. That's our why.
Yeah.
And then it goes, the first step really is to have some sort of approach to job evaluation or job architecture, because that sets the foundation for everything we do, actually not just in reward, but things like learning and development or succession planning and all these other things. So job architecture, job evaluation is the foundation. And then around that, organizations are building salary ranges. So it's what we know, what most employees want to know is that if I stay with this organization, how can I progress in my career? And as I progress in my career, how is my pay going to grow? And there are other employees that might not be that motivated to grow their career. They just want to do the role that they're doing.
Yeah.
And they're thinking, well, this is the pay range for my role. And if I start at the entry point, how am I going to progress over time to the higher end of that range? And I think that's where the transparency comes from. If we really want to drive performance, we want to drive certain behaviors and greater contribution from our employees, we need to be transparent around how we make pay decisions and how those behaviors and contributions is going to result in progression for our employees. Um,
Yeah.
because the way that we manage pay in our organizations is pay is the most powerful way that we can communicate to our employees about what we value in our organization. So every time we give someone a pay rise, every time someone gets a promotion or a bonus, we're demonstrating or we're communicating to our employees, look, because of this reason we're giving a pay rise or a bonus. So it's the best way of reinforcing those things that we value in our organization.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, it makes me really think about the number of organizations potentially that don't have established pay principles. I mean, especially, given the data that you've collected, that's about a third of organizations that maybe have an idea of what they do, but they don't necessarily have like an established or easily communicated or documented process or principle around pay. What would you or what do you say to those 33% of organizations that maybe you even work with who don't have established pay principles and processes. And maybe there are listeners who are like, oh, we totally do not have that and we really could use it. Where do they start? What would be, I mean, you've kind of talked about like the scale at which these things kind of make sense methodically, but is there like, a principle or a process that fundamentally every company should have, even if they are still working on establishing those more broad principles?
Yeah, a lot of these organizations, when you look at that 33% or the third of organizations, often you'll find that the HR team want to do something, and the challenge is convincing the senior leadership team. And I think that's where we need to share the research with them or try and convince them, because all our employees have access to data anyway through Glassdoor, Indeed, all these different websites.
Sure.
And we know that more than ever, they're having conversations around pay. Gen Z in particular are discussing pay. So, do you want to be part of that conversation, shape that conversation, or do you want to react to it every time somebody uh, threatens to resign or they demand a pay rise? And so I think that's what we need to try and do. We need to share some of the research around. There's a very powerful research by a company called Josh Bersin, which talked about how well communicated pay equity is 13 times more likely to engage and retain your employees than higher levels of pay. So their research showed that well communicated pay equity led to better business outcomes, better financials, customer service, engagement, retention, even more likely to innovate and adapt to change. So there's a big business case for convincing our leaders to do it. And then on the other hand, we're seeing all these legislative changes coming through. So I know in the US, a number of states have implemented pay transparency laws. They're
That's
banning
right.
organizations from asking employees what their current salary is or their past history. The EU Pay Transparency Directive has come through, which is, the biggest change we've seen in terms of changes that organizations need to make. And I think these 33, this third of organizations should look at how they can proactively make some changes to get that competitive advantage instead of 3 months before legislation comes in, they're forced into doing something which is going to land very badly with their employees.
Yeah, it's a great point. And you're absolutely right. There are a number of states. I think it's 26 plus, so more than half of the states in the United States do have pay transparency laws, which some also include the requirement for publishing the range in a job advertisement or a job description, which is also a part of your salary reports or your global trends report. And I think I know just in doing browsing, because sometimes I'm curious, like, are companies up to speed? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? And maybe that makes me nosy, but I really like to look to see which companies are compliant, and I keep track of that stuff in my mind. But there are companies that are operating or publishing job descriptions in states that require pay ranges who don't include pay ranges on their job descriptions. And I would imagine that for a candidate or for, let's say a consumer in this case, like someone who's looking to apply to these jobs, I would imagine that the best way for them to assess whether a company has pay principles and processes or not is just to first look at the job description. Because especially in states where they're required, if they don't have pay ranges, it's probably a good indication that they don't really have established pay principles. Regardless of it being required or not, sure, maybe they have some level of ranges internally, but if they're not fundamentally following the requirements by law, that is kind of an indication of a number of things. And then similarly, if a company is hiring in a state that doesn't require pay transparency laws and they are, or doesn't require pay transparency, or doesn't have pay transparency laws, I should say, if they are publishing ranges regardless, that's also an indication of where they fall within this established principles kind of realm. And so I say that
Yeah.
because one of the thoughts that I had when you were sharing, what companies are doing and why they have these established pay principles or how they establish them is that there's this benefit, of course, internally as an HR professional. And there's also a benefit for future employees to know what their growth can look like just through some of those indications. If they are looking for growth economically rather than in title or in scope, that this is another way for them to really see that, and to get a feel for what that company prioritizes. Certainly, companies that are still following the law don't necessarily have fully established pay principles. Maybe the pay range on the job description is their bare minimum, but it's a start at least, I think.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It's funny you talked about researching a lot of companies that are not publishing their pay ranges. I have to admit I also do that sometimes.
It's
And
amazing.
uh, the funniest thing is, if you look at a lot of the big consultancies, the global consultancies that are preaching about pay transparency now because it's the trend. You go on any of their websites, and 90% of them don't have a salary range, and they're telling everyone how to
How
be
to
more
get some salary
transparent.
ranges going. It's ironic,
um,
isn't it?
but with the sharing of ranges, I mean, the other thing that was really interesting in the report was 68% of organizations said they had salary ranges, but only 26% of them were sharing those salary ranges internally with their employees. And I think that is showing that a lot of companies have done the work of putting some pay ranges together, but they're worried, or they're reluctant to share that information with employees. And that also links back to why actually a lot of companies don't publish salary ranges on job ads, because
Mm.
what we find is a lot of organizations and HR teams are struggling to recruit people. So what they end up doing is hiring people on salaries that are higher than their existing and their loyal employees,
Mm-hmm.
because the market is moving. If you try and apply for a job externally, you could end up getting a 10-20% pay rise. But if you
Yeah.
stay with an organization, 90% of people are getting a 3% pay rise. So the market is moving, and the challenge organizations are facing is they put a salary range. Their employees are going to see, well, why are you willing to pay somebody else more than you're willing to pay somebody who's already making a contribution? And I think that comes from that lack of consistency in how we make pay decisions. So the other thing in the report was 51% of organizations said they're still asking candidates for their salary,
Mm-hmm.
current salary. My my view is that that's probably a lot higher, because if HR is not asking, line managers are asking. And even in those cases when we're not asking, we go around that question by saying, what are your expectations?
Yes. Yeah.
And your expectations are made up from your past experiences. So if instead of asking this question, we have a very clear process to say in organizations, step one is you should know as an organization what is the salary range that you're willing to pay for every job in your organization. And that comes through job architectures. Let's say you have 7 levels and all your jobs are placed on those 7 levels. If you're at level 3 within the finance function, this is what we're willing to pay. Then
Mm-hmm.
step two is you assess, or you figure out what is the difference between someone who sits at the bottom of that range and someone who sits at the top of the range in your organization. So at the top of the range, maybe they have some specific qualifications. At the top of the range, they're coaching and mentoring people within the team because of their technical expertise. And then you use those definitions, you use that process in your recruitment to first advertise the salary range. And then when you interview people, you assess based on the test or the interviews where you think they should fit within that salary range, regardless of what their expectations are, and regardless of um, what um, they're currently on. And that's how we're going to bridge the gap. Because yes, we're going to miss out on some people who uh, won't apply for that job or won't accept that job. But we have to go back to our principles. Do we really have a commitment to pay equity, to diversity, inclusion, to fairness? And if so,
Hmm.
we have to stop this discrepancy of paying whatever we want to bring people in while we're, not treating our own employees fairly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everything you said is 100% true. And I think it's really important for those listening who do have some influence on this whole process within an organization, or maybe are thinking about influencing the process, if it's not already established, that you look at the people within your organization first and figure out where they fall. And it seems like common sense, but we see it all the time. I hear about it all the time in my DMs and my email, that people are getting paid X and then they look at the same job that's posted online by their company and they're way below the range. So this is just an example, I think, of decision makers moving too fast and not really taking into consideration their existing loyal employees. And when you're making these decisions, you have to really take into consideration what your existing population is earning. And it also is a great exercise to determine whether your existing population is being paid fairly or not. Like, if a company determines that a job is within the range of $130,000 a year to $200,000 a year, and their employees that are currently within the organization making less than $130,000 a year, it then requires that organization to really figure out how they're going to bring those existing employees up to that budgetary minimum. Because if, or at least I should say, the range is minimum. Because at the end of the day, if you're looking for someone externally and you're willing to pay, to your point, within that range, you have to also be willing to pay your current team within that range. It's a huge misstep, I think, by organizations when they don't take that extra 30 minutes to look at their,
Mm.
their existing salaries. And at the very least, they should ensure that the range captures those existing
Exactly.
employees,
Yeah.
so maybe those existing employees are a little bit below where a company wants to fall. You should extend your range to at least incorporate those and still figure out how you're going to right side them. That's
Yeah,
my
and I,
opinion.
I think most of these organizations that are not publishing a range when they recruit, they they're probably thinking, well, we bring someone in at whatever we need to, and nobody's going to find out internally. But we know that people are discussing these things
Yes.
internally, and what ends up happening is, we bring in one person to fill in one vacancy, and we end up making the other 10 people disengaged because
Right.
they're all thinking, we've been working hard and not getting rewarded, and somebody else who's just come in is negotiated a higher salary. And so that's why I think pay equity, and that well communicated pay equity, is, once you start to dig deeper, that's why it's 13 times more impactful in business results and engagement, retention, and so on, because it's, you know short-term thinking is really damaging us in the long term.
100%. You're absolutely right. And um, I think I'd be remiss not to bring up probably the most shocking part of your report. At least I was shocked. And this
Hmm.
is related to the gender pay gap reporting. I was shocked to read that 65, let me see, 65% of organizations are not calculating or reporting gender pay gap by job level or grade. So this, to me, maybe I'm not interpreting this correctly, so please correct me, but that to me is translating that those 65% of organizations that are part of this survey data are not actually evaluating. They're not going through the process to determine what that pay gap is between, genders
Hmm.
within that specific role. Is that what that statistic is showing?
Yes, it is. So gender pay gap reporting became compulsory in the UK many years ago. And so organizations with over 250 employees have an obligation to publish their gender pay gap. And it's six numbers they have to publish. So they have to publish the mean, the median on base,
Hmm.
bonus, and quartiles of people getting those payments. And so what that means is that percentage that you're looking at, a lot of those organizations are doing what's mandatory, which is reporting those numbers at an organizational level. But when you say an organization has a 15% gender pay gap or a -5% pay gap, it doesn't really tell us anything about pay. It could be because there's a female CEO, and that's why it's -5%. It could be
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, the exec team is 80% male, and that's why it's 15%. You could also have a lot of pay inequity with 0% gender pay gap, and you could have
Yeah.
no pay inequity with 10% gender pay gap. So it's really digging deeper, and that's, like you said, when you start to look at it by job level, by function, that's where you can investigate to say, is this justified? Is this something we need to do something about? And unfortunately, not many organizations are digging deeper into that.
Yeah, that's okay. So I'm glad that that's how I read it, but I'm also sad that that's accurate because, I think maybe it just means that I've worked at great organizations, which I have, but I was shocked because I couldn't believe that this wasn't happening by the majority of organizations that have been surveyed in your report. There's certainly we all know that data and statistics, we can enable them, we can allow them to enable our message, right? Like we
Mm,
can leverage data in different ways. And to your point, if there is a pay gap or there isn't a pay gap, that doesn't necessarily, at least at the organizational level, it doesn't necessarily point to what's really happening by level or within specific jobs. And I think it's really important, especially, actually I should say regardless of the size of organization, to really think about I should say how they look at gender and pay equity by level. And of course, this pulls into the framework job architecture, because certainly
mm,
companies do have to have some sort of understanding by, at least within that job architecture, by what level people sit or within what level people sit. But I also think, just regardless of that, if a company is smaller and they have, a manager level, a senior manager level, or, executive, and then non-manager, individual contributor, whatever those levels look like, you don't really have to have a minimum number of employees. Every company can really look at this, including small businesses. I mean, if anything, I think smaller companies have way more discretion and influence over pay practices because it hasn't gotten the snowball effect. Once you're in a larger organization, sometimes it's really hard to get your hands around these things, unless of course you have a compensation committee or a compensation team
mm.
within the HR department, or within finance. So this has been really helpful. I think I would love, for us to kind of keep a pulse on this. I mean, maybe you'll come back for a third round in another year or so, another 2 years or so. But I really appreciate you walking us through a lot of the data in this report. Is this report accessible to any of the listeners by any chance?
Yes, it's available for anyone to download for free. So it's available on our website, which is 3r-strategy.com, and so you can just go on our website and download the full report for free.
Amazing, amazing. I'll make sure that that's linked in the show notes. And if any of the listeners want to get connected or maybe reach out, to understand a little bit more about what you and 3R Strategy do, where should they do that?
So you can get in touch with me directly through LinkedIn. So Rameez Kaleem. I don't think there are many Rameez Kaleems, but a 3R Strategy. So so either through the website or LinkedIn is the best way to get in touch with me.
Amazing. Well, Rameez, thank you so much again for helping us have a better understanding of this really important data that you've pulled together. And thanks again for coming back on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Traci.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.